Good morning, colleagues. Can I get a thumbs up if colleagues can hear me? Or Dr. David, can you indicate if you can hear me?
Hi, Kosi. Yes, I can hear you and see you clearly.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning once again, colleagues, and thank you for joining today's workshop. Before we can move on, please note that this workshop is recorded. We will keep the recording of this workshop and will be shared to your respective model communities, which include the supervisor community as well as the PDRF model community. So colleagues, if you are not enrolled in any of the model communities or at our RCD management system, kindly send us an email at supervision cause or Nkosi2N, and we will be able to assist you in terms of registering your profile. So on RCD management system, that is where our resources are at the moment. So we keep and provide all the previous workshop recordings as well as the resources, which includes the presentation of each workshop. So if you can access that platform, it's available on Ulink, and services, the last option is RCDMS. So, and now let's get into the session. Welcome to today's workshop, Mastering the Arts of Constructive Feedback as a supervisor. And we are honored to have Dr. Lorenzo David as our facilitator for today's. But before we move on into introducing our facilitator, I would like to go through some few housekeeping rules. Right now, colleagues, all your mics are muted. However, during the proceeding of the workshop, I will enable all your mics. Please do make sure that your mic is muted when you're not speaking or when you don't have a question. However, you are more than welcome to send a chat or under Q&A any question that you might have during the workshop, or alternatively, just raise a hand and I will notify Dr. Lorenzo David that someone has raised the hand, and he will attend to your question or any contribution you would like to make. I will also be sending a feedback evaluation. I'll post it under the chat towards the end of the workshop. We kindly request you colleagues to take your 2 minutes or 3 minutes in helping us to improve our service delivery. So we kindly request you to fill that feedback in. It also ensures that colleagues who have attended, they receive the certificate of attendance for any workshop they have attended, because that is where we pull out the details of each colleague that attended the workshop. Another announcement I would like to make, colleagues, we have sent out all the certificates of attendance for May workshops. So if you attended any workshop for May, and you didn't get any certificate for May workshop, kindly send us an email on supervision course on Nkosi2N with the title of the workshop that you attended, and we will go back to our records and check if indeed you attended the workshop, and we'll be happy to issue a certificate. Some colleagues have sent their emails whereby there was some information missing in their certificate. Those certificates will be corrected in this week. So colleagues, I'll attend to your emails. Those who have sent me, those who have requested to be sent another certificate. So I will send back those certificates. And now, colleagues, allow me to introduce our facilitator, Dr. Lorenzo David. Dr. Lorenzo David is currently a coordinator at the Research Capacity Development Unit, Postgraduate School at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. David was recently awarded a PhD in biochemistry for his assessment of transferring tech gold palladium and gold palladium bimetallic nanoparticles and their potential for anti-cancer drug delivery at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. By adapting a holistic approach to education, Dr. David hopes to inspire students to achieve personal and academic success with a hands-on and learner-centric approach to value-based learning. Once again, thank you for all colleagues who have joined us today. And thank you to our facilitator, Dr. Lorenzo David. We're looking forward to a productive and insightful session. I now hand over to Dr. David for him to start the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Nkosi. I'm just going to switch on my camera for a few minutes just so everyone can put a face to the name. So once again, welcome to all of the colleagues. I'd like to thank you for making the time to join us today for what is, I think, a very important session regarding feedback. Before we get started, I just would like to run something by the audience. So for those of you who've been attending some of these sessions that we've had recently, you'd notice that we've had quite a few sessions focusing on feedback. And very often what we've actually been doing is looking at feedback from the perspective of the supervisor. So this has been covered by sessions by Dr. Gurin, Callie Gurin from La Trobe University, as well as a few sessions that I've conducted over the past few weeks. So in this presentation, what I've also done is I've added in a section. It's actually the first section we're going to discuss regarding feedback from the position of a student. So many of us, I can see from the list, are in the process. We are currently PDRFs, and even in terms of receiving feedback, I think it's quite a useful tool because at any point, even when we work in academia, we will always have obviously a line manager or boss that we report to. So the way in which we process their feedback, not only limited to academia, but in general, I think these are useful tools which will better equip us moving forward. So I hope the audience is fine with this one amendment that I've made to the presentation. And with that, I will actually close my camera and I will start off the presentation. Ms. Nkosi, can you please just let me know when you're able to see my screen and if it's progressing through the slides? Ms. Nkosi, are you there?
Yes, Doc. Nothing is showing up at the moment, so probably
Okay,
it's still loading on your side.
let me try this. Okay, I think it should be working.
Yes, it
Able
is
to
now.
see. Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Okay, so once again, colleagues, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to try and keep this presentation a bit shorter than what we usually do, hopefully leaving a bit of time for discussions as well as any questions that any members of the audience may have. So, like we said, the title of today's presentation is Mastering the Art of Constructive Feedback as a Supervisor. And as you can see, I have made some amendments to the actual content, so I hope that's okay with everyone. So you can see the session objectives. We hope to cover quite a few different sections today. The first few are going to focus on feedback from the perspective of a student. So the approach and the thinking behind this is that, firstly, no matter what job that we're going to be in academia or industry, we will always be receiving feedback from, let's say, our line manager or our boss. So how we process that feedback is very important, not only for us to teach this to our students, but for us to implement in our own daily work as well. The next point of it, in terms of feedback, is in order for us to understand how to better construct our feedback to the student, we need to be able to place ourselves in a similar situation. Now, all of us have been in the position of being a student previously and studying towards a higher degree. And I think sometimes as we progress, we sometimes forget, and as it is completely human to do so, what it felt like to be a student and receive this feedback. So I always feel that placing ourselves in these positions allows us to have a different perspective. And this perspective is actually what will encourage growth and development of key skills that we hope to obviously bring to the forefront as well. So in terms of the session objectives, you can see there's quite a few here. I'm just going to go through them. The first one is understand how to receive and use feedback constructively. And this is from the position of a student. We also would like to discuss learn how to prepare for supervision conversations. And just as a disclaimer, wherever we see supervision conversations, I'd also like to think about it in terms of any conversations that we're having with our line managers or, our bosses as well. So we'd also like to go on to how to use structured approaches to ask questions to clarify feedback. One of the worst things we can do, especially when we're receiving feedback, is to not be completely clear on what is expected of us. Sometimes the fear of asking the question can actually put us in a much more difficult position because we are not answering the feedback as required. We'd also like to go through how do we build confidence and ownership in the feedback process, establish effective communication habits with your supervisor, understand the purpose and impact of feedback in postgraduate supervision, recognize the characteristics of constructive as well as developmental feedback, and how can we adapt style to suit different stages of student research. And I'd like to add something in here in terms of we understand now, this is more from the perspective of a supervisor. Every person is obviously different. The way they respond to conversation, the way that they would like to communicate. So as much as I feel that it's important for us to adapt our feedback style to different stages of student research, I also feel it is a key skill for us to understand how do we adapt our conversations with the students as well, based on the student as an individual. Because we can't just have it's my personal belief that we can't have a blanket approach, in how we address all students. I'm not telling us to go and, you know, uh, completely change the way that we communicate. But I think that if we are able to effectively communicate these ideas and reach the student, get them to understand what we are trying to say, I think that our feedback will be better received, and thereafter the changes will be made to a higher standard. The next last 2 points would be how do we use tone, timing, and framing to promote student confidence and autonomy? And this section relies generally on, when a student is at the beginning of their research project, how do we structure our feedback? What should involve at the beginning of a research project? Should it focus more on, let's just say, which specific method they're going to be using, or maybe punctuation and grammar and polishing of their text? Or should it focus more on actually guiding them in terms of the direction of the study? So, they say, in terms of the right thing at the wrong time is bad. So I think a similar approach can be taken here. Even excellent feedback, but if the timing is not correct and if we're overwhelming the student, it can actually have a detrimental effect to them as well. So it's just something for us to keep at the back of our minds. And the last point is I'd like us to reflect on our own feedback practices. And this is something that will be done, more personally and obviously as we think about it. And how will we adapt, if any, changes in terms of ongoing improvement? Now, I'm a very strong believer I believe strongly that we are always improving. No matter where we are, no matter what our position is, we always have the capacity to learn. I think that's why so many of us are still in the university setting, because we have that love of learning. So how do we go about implementing these changes, and what can we even learn from our students as the generations continue to move forward as well? So after that very long session objectives, I'd just like to move into the first section, which would be making feedback work for you, a student's guide to effective supervision conversations. So like we've said previously, this section will relate to, if we are a PhD student, if we are a PDRF, or even if, how do we structure these conversations with our line managers and our bosses? Because we will always receive feedback. And I think the way in which we look at feedback will actually shape the outcome of, the assignment or the project that we're working on. So we take it back, why feedback matters as a student. So if we place ourselves back in that position, and let's just say we've submitted our first draft to our supervisor, why is that feedback essentially important? In the initial conversations that we have with our supervisors, sometimes it's very easy for us to get excited about a project and miss over the finer details, which are actually very important to that particular study. So I think feedback is essential from the perspective of a student because it helps us to develop as an independent researcher. And I think that is the goal of many of us. At some point, we would like to continue this level of independence. The next point is feedback or timely feedback can actually improve your writing as well as your project direction. It can help you to use your time more efficiently. So we can look at this from both perspectives. If we are providing this detailed level of feedback, we are also able to better produce independent researchers. By providing timely feedback, we can also improve the writing of our students as well as allow them to work more efficiently, not, for example, using wrong experimental procedures or not taking the project in the incorrect direction. Feedback also builds our academic voice and our confidence. So we'll go through it a bit later, and we've touched on this topic in a few previous sections. But in terms of feedback, one of the techniques that we've discussed previously is the sandwich technique. Firstly, you say, this is what I like about your particular submission. Then we can go on to, these are areas that I feel can be improved upon. And then you can end it out by being like, this is how we will work on improving it, or we will work on this together and we will get the project to where it needs to be, or the level at where it needs to be as well. I think in terms of why feedback matters as a student as well, good feedback relationships actually reduce stress and isolation. And many of us can think back to when we were students and you received some feedback, and it may not have been the most clear or directive feedback in terms of you may have gotten comments such as, this is wrong, or rewrite, or improve clarity, or even sometimes you get a what with a few question marks. Now, what this does in terms of a student is it's not guiding them in terms of what they actually need to change in order for their work to reach the desired level of quality. So I think that when we look at feedback in this perspective, we can see how essential it is, not only for allowing the student to actually complete their degree, but also allowing them to build themselves up and develop academically as well as professionally. So we'll go quickly over some of the consequences of poor feedback. So firstly, as a student, it can delay your progress. If you submit a chapter and you're only getting feedback 3 to 4 months later, it severely delays your progress. And we understand that, time is not something that many higher degree students can actually afford to waste. It also may lead to misalignment with the supervisor's expectations. So if we are not providing clear, concise, directive feedback to our students, this can lead to misalignments and misunderstandings between what the student thinks they have to do and what we expect as a supervisor. And by doing that, obviously, that is also going to use up time unnecessarily as well. I think there's also an aspect of missed learning opportunities by us not guiding the students into what they're doing wrong, but also how they can improve it. We are not essentially equipping them on how to grow. And, their next draft will be of a similar standard as what was done previously. I think it's very important for us to notice, to take note of the fact that when it comes to providing feedback for a student, yes, there's two aims to it. The first one is going to be, we need this chapter to be at a particular standard, but we also want to develop them so that the next draft is of a better quality. And the next degree that they do, they're actually starting at a higher level as well. And then we understand in terms of poor feedback, it can cause severe strain to the supervision relationship. And this just creates a very tense working environment where neither the supervisor or the student would actually like to engage in at all. So this is something that we've actually spoken about in previous sections, feedback as a dialogue. And so we've just titled this feedback as a dialogue and not a monologue. So very often as students, or when we're going to, speak to our line managers as an example, we obviously want to hear what they have to say because, they have very often more experience, they have an idea of the bigger picture. But I think that feedback as a dialogue is actually important because it allows us to clarify any gray areas, shall we say, that we have in terms of what they are providing. So from the perspective of a student, I think it's important for us to come prepared with reflections or questions. So if we have submitted a particular chapter, or let's just say in this case, if we have submitted a paper and we've submitted it to our supervisor to have a quick look over before we actually submit it to the journal, I think, and they provide us the feedback before we have the meeting. I think it's important for us to try and read the feedback clearly, and come with any reflections or questions. Are there certain areas that you've identified? What do you agree with? What would you like to discuss further? And I think the way in which we frame these conversations is very important. We can discuss almost any topic as long as it is done in a respectful manner. That is a personal belief of mine. So even when it comes to from the perspective of a student or when we speak into a line manager, if there's something that we may not agree on, I think in a healthy discussion, this can actually be hashed out quite nicely. I think also that from a perspective of a student, it's important to treat feedback sessions as collaborative discussions. So we're not just going to be passive in this meeting, but we try to obviously have these discussions. And the point of this is we want to improve the piece of work or the project or help our unit or research group as much as possible. And I think a shift in the mindset is something that's quite important here in terms of when we are students, we need to actually motivate them to see themselves as co-creators of the research journey, not just someone who is following our instruction for the sake of following our instruction. So by doing this here, by a student seeing themselves as a co-creator, they have a sense of pride in their own work, and this will actually cause them to become, or rather promote them to become more independent in their research journey as well. And just as a note for us to add, from the perspective of the student, this is what we can actually do. But I think that when we take off the student hat and we put on the supervisor hat, we have to create the environment in which the student feels comfortable enough to actually have these conversations with us. We need to create the environment in which they feel that this can actually be a dialogue, and we need to make it known to them that they are actually co-creators of the research journey. I had a very interesting conversation recently with a professor, and so the conversation just went something along the lines of they were explaining to me and just providing a bit of insight in terms of how they provided feedback to their student. How do they review submissions? And something that stood out to me, and I've mentioned it in previous workshops, is that they did tell me that they do not want to change the student's work to the point where it is now the supervisor's work and not the student. Because once we start to do that, then when it goes submission, who is actually being examined? Is it the student or is it the supervisor? So I think that, supervision is actually a wonderful thing, and it's a privilege that many of us have and hopefully will continue to have into the future. But I think there's a fine balance that we need to take here in terms of we want to equip the student to be at the level that they need to be at, but at the same time, we want them to develop it in their own right and become independent researchers with their own academic voice as well. Okay, so we're going to go quickly onto a 4-step feedback conversation model. I do understand that I'm speaking quite a lot and quite fast. So I'd just like to say quickly, if there is anyone that has any questions, or if there's anything that you'd maybe like to add onto what we're discussing, please feel free to unmute your mic. Or alternatively, like always, please feel free to pop a message in the chat box. And Mr. Nkosi is actually monitoring the chat, so he will be able to bring those questions to our attention as well. Okay, so moving back to the slide, how do we go about, putting this, constructing this conversation? So the first thing is, as a student, or even as, if you're going to have a discussion with line manager, it's important for us to prepare. So firstly, we review the feedback. We identify questions, maybe something that's not clear. Maybe there is some additional information that was not laid out that actually changes the feedback, and then we need to understand our goal. I think having these conversations when we are prepared versus while we are just, for the lack of a better word, winging it, it changes the dimensions of this actual conversation. So prepare. The next thing is engage. So we need to share our thoughts and don't just listen passively. But like I'm saying, this can always be done in a respectful manner. We don't need to cut off one another, either as a student or when we're speaking. We can always have these conversations openly and clearly with mutual respect. Something which is essential is asking clarifying questions. So sometimes when we receive feedback, and even in a discussion, there may be certain areas that we are not completely clear about. And I think that rather than, let me reframe this, sometimes for many of us, and this is something that I personally experienced a lot when I was studying previously, um, was that the fear of asking questions for how it may look, how it may make you look. But what I've noticed over the years is that it is better to ask clarifying questions and put yourself out there in the beginning than rather submit a piece of work which is not to the standard of what your supervisor is expecting, as well as not properly representing your ability. So it is important for us to ask clarifying follow-up questions until you are sure you understand. And this can involve everything from rephrasing and saying, so from what I understand, this is what you're looking for, or this is what I should do, or this is the approach that we are taking. And I think in the end, it's always important for us to, when we close in, to agree on the next steps to say, okay, thank you. So from what I understand from this conversation, these are the changes that I need to make. This is what I need to submit to you by this date, and clarify any expectations that will be in terms of the submission date, etc. The next slide focuses on breaking feedback down into manageable aspects. And this lays in from a previous session that we've done, I think it was last week Wednesday. So when it comes to this, as a student, once again, it's important to ask for clarity regarding structure, content, argumentation, tone, as well as what referencing sound. These are more minor changes which we will be making. And then we use the feedback to prioritize the edits. And then we did mention in the last session something relating to global comments, which means that if your supervisor, or if we are giving feedback and we say it's a global comment, instead of us writing the same comment out 5, 10, 15 times, we say this is a global comment which applies to the entire document. Please make these changes throughout. So this could be anything from, what a student or us as a student is actually making our sentences too long and therefore is losing the reader along the way. So we can say global comment, please make these sentences more concise. And you can, by splitting it into two as example and linking the two together. And therefore, it just saves you time in terms of your feedback. Okay, so we're moving back to the position of the student. So the question is, what makes feedback helpful? And how do we go about asking for it? Now, asking for help and asking clarifying questions is not something that's going to come very easily to everyone. Many people are very independent and they like to figure it out themselves. But I always think, why do we need to reinvent the wheel when we can just ask these clarifying questions and basically save ourselves a lot of time? Time is something that obviously we can't afford to be wasting. So as a student, request feedback at specific stages. So if you are doing a major project for your particular research group, I think it's important for you to have these conversations as often as possible to ensure that the project is actually staying on track. Same thing in terms of a study, the same thing in terms of writing a particular article. We don't want to spend days or weeks writing out a particular section only to find out that that is not what is required for this particular submission. I think, as much as we all like to hear positives, at the end of the day, we all are human, but I think that we always learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes. And in doing that, I think it's important for us to ask for both strengths as well as areas for improvement, to have a balanced approach. Obviously, when you're having this conversation with your line manager, maybe just focus on which areas can I improve on. I would really like to improve the quality of my work. And the last point would be is to set up regular times to receive feedback. Now, I understand this is not always possible, especially as a supervisor with time being so limited. There's many different tasks that a supervisor has. But I think from both perspectives, if we look at it, if a student has a fixed time every week, or every 2 weeks, or every month, they know that there is a goal that they are working towards. If we leave it open-ended, students will very often just, you know, take a week or two off, and then they will come in the last two works and try and catch up. And then obviously the quality is not going to be there. In terms of a supervisor, if we know that we are blocking out time, let's just say once a month, to meet with a particular student to discuss the status of their project, is blocked out in our calendar, we can also prepare for that. And I think the entire experience between the supervisor and the student can actually be enhanced by having these set meetings as well. Okay, so now we move on to the section about how do we actually go about having or constructing this conversation. So I'd just like to put a small, we'll say a disclaimer here. We have to always be able to structure our conversation based on the audience. So if we put it into context, when you are, let's just say you're presenting at a conference. When you are presenting at a conference, or if you are presenting your research to a high school, the level of detail and the way that you construct your conversation is going to be different. Why? Because your audience is different. So I think similar tools can be used when we are actually speaking to either our students or when we are speaking to our line managers or our bosses. So in that regard, let's say we can practice using, could you clarify what you meant by? Or if you are, once again, a student, you say, would you like me to revise the section and to resubmit it? So, and the last point we'll say is, do you think I've interpreted your feedback correctly? So what this does is you are asking questions of the other person. And I think very often when we are having these conversations with our supervisors, we need to take into account that, you know what, they are actually seeing a picture that we aren't. And this is due to obviously their position as well as the experience that they have. So very often when they are asking us to, let's just say, add on an additional section or additional part of our research, there is a rationale behind it, but we just don't have that perspective. When our bosses or line managers are asking us, to, let's just say, add this particular section to what we're lecturing, or to add this on to a practical, there is a reason why they are asking this. So I think the way in which we construct these conversations is actually very important, and the way in which we approach it is actually also very important. Okay, so when feedback conversations are challenging, and I think very often this is very possible. So if we're having a conversation with a student, we need to be prepared for an emotional response, especially if there are major corrections. So if a student is already delayed with their submission, they submit a piece of work to you and you send it back with major corrections, there is a good chance there's going to be an emotional response from that student. The same thing, we also need to prepare for cultural or communication style differences. And this is something we have touched on in previous workshops. I think it's, once again, we need to tailor our approach based on the audience that we are communicating with. And the last point is we need to understand from the perspective of a student, when do we escalate or request mediation support? If there's been conversations that's been ongoing for a very long period of time, when is the correct time for us to actually escalate this, or ask maybe a member to step in to mediate the situation as well? I think when it comes to feedback conversations, while these are some of the extremes that we see, very often these conversations or any issues can actually be solved with a simple discussion, one where there's mutual respect both in the supervisor and the student as well. Okay, so these are 10 habits of feedback. We've got feedback savvy students that we've identified and that we've researched. So the reason why I want to put this up is, if we are having these conversations, if we are in the position of a student, this is what we can do. And from the perspective of a supervisor, this is what we can encourage our students to do as well. So as we know, it's always important for us to prepare before a meeting. So not all students do this, and I think it's good for us at the beginning of the supervision agreement for us to actually clarify this. It's important for us to ask clarifying questions, because if we are receiving vague feedback, chances are the next draft is not going to be much better than the previous one. As a student, we always find it useful to keep a feedback journal, and also reflect before reacting. So we understand, especially from the perspective of a student, if we receive very harsh feedback, instead of us going immediately and addressing the issue with the supervisor or with whoever it may be, I think it's important for us to actually reflect, think about it carefully, remove emotion, or wait until the emotion subsides in the situation, and thereafter you go and address the feedback. As a student, it's good for us to request feedback early. We understand this is not always possible, but it's good for us to put this out there, as well as focus on growth, not perfection. Many of, or rather, I should say, when I first started out writing, I'd always try to make every paragraph as perfect as possible. In my mind, anyway, it was far from perfect, but as perfect as possible before moving on to the next paragraph or the next section. And what we actually notice is that actually uses up a lot of time. So when it comes to receiving this feedback as well, and writing in general, I think it's important for us to receive the feedback in the point that it's there to help us to improve. And not always, perfection is not something that is easily attained. We'd also like to discuss in terms of understand supervisor preferences. So just like from the position of a supervisor, we need to be cognizant of our student. I think as a student, we also need to be cognizant of the preferences of our supervisor. What is the writing style? What is the level of detail? Are there particular data points that they prefer us to actually highlight, etc.? Writing style as well. It's also important for us to practice paraphrasing our feedback to ensure that what our supervisor is saying or what we are saying is actually being received. And thereafter, follow up on agreed actions. There's nothing worse than having a fantastic meeting where we set all of these deadlines and we don't meet any of them. And then I think something that we've touched on in the previous section as well is build a network for peer feedback. So as a student, we can lean quite heavily on, rather I should say, we can use the experience of, let's just say, PhDs or PDRFs who have actually been through the process to actually help us to improve through the writing process. We will probably have more interaction with them than we would actually with our supervisor on a daily basis. And some of the key takeaways for this section is that feedback is actually a shared responsibility, both from the perspective of a supervisor and a student. As a student, we can actually lead the process just as much as your supervisor, obviously while showing respect to your supervisor. And the last point will be structure and reflection turn feedback into a powerful tool. I think the way in which we approach feedback is actually essential to us growing as academics. We will always receive correction and feedback no matter what stage of life that we're at. So by us understanding that this is actually not just to correct us and show us where we've gone wrong, but it's there to equip us, I think by looking at changing our perspective, we actually would be able to progress ourselves much quicker. And one slide I actually wanted to add, I've actually added in a bit late, would be what to do if feedback feels too harsh. At the end of the day, I know that we all want to be as level-headed as possible, but at the end of the day, we are people and we do feel emotions. So it's okay to feel upset, but let yourself process first. Never react emotionally, never have a discussion while you are emotional. The next point is ask yourself, is the critique about the work, or is the critique about the work, not me? You should actually say the critique is about the work and not me. Thereafter, you go and put a plan into place. So what is one concrete thing that I can act on? And by setting these small achievable goals, we'll see that it actually gives your confidence a boost. Receiving harsh feedback is never an easy thing, and it can take a severe knock to our confidence. So how do we go about overcoming that? We set small achievable goals. Set out a list and start working through it. And we'll notice upon every success, every achievement that we have, we actually will start building up our confidence again, as well as improving our skill set. I think the way in which we can respond is to this feedback is actually very important. So we can say, something along as, thank you, I'd like to take some time to think through this feedback. You don't have to respond immediately. And the last point is, if you feel the feedback is very harsh, you could always send a message and say, would you mind if we talk through one or two of your comments? It does not make, there's some ambiguity from my side as well. So that covers, I hope, from the perspective of a student. We've gone through a few different sections, and now I'd like to go on to from the perspective of the supervisor. So mastering the art of constructive feedback as a supervisor. So these are topics that we have, like I've mentioned, we've spoken in great length over, quite a few workshops. But just to summarize it once again, what does good feedback look like from a supervisor? So we've looked at it from the perspective of a student, from the perspective of a supervisor. As a supervisor, we should focus on the learning of the student and not just the product. Yes, when it comes to a student enrolling for a higher degree, we want them to complete that degree, but that is not the only goal that we have as a supervisor. We also want to equip them and we want them to become better academics moving forward. I think always as a supervisor, I always like to have a balanced approach. This is whether you are supervising formally or informally. I think it's always important for you to balance critique with encouragement. Too much of critique, we basically can affect the student's confidence. Too much of encouragement without any critique will actually make the student think that they're on the right path when they're actually not. So in both extremes, we see that we are actually hurting the student and not helping them. So I think a balanced approach is something very important here. We should try, so good feedback from a supervisor should be timely. So if we agree 2 weeks to review a particular chapter, you know what, let's try and stick to that as much as possible and be as specific. Now, I do understand that there are deadlines that come in between, sometimes a last minute request for work. So if something like happens, nothing stops us from communicating with the student and telling them, please note that your feedback will be delayed by a week. And you don't even have to give a reason. Just say, there's just some work that has come up, etc. I think very often these emotions that arise from students is from lack of communication. They have submitted, they've worked hard, probably put in the hard hours, and they've sent it to you. Even though you are busy with work, from their perspective, they may feel as if my supervisor doesn't care. And that is just miscommunication between all parties. So something which can be easily avoided. Good feedback should also give actionable advice. It should tell the student, this is where you're not correct or where you're wrong, and this is how you can actually correct it, instead of just telling them this is wrong, figure out your own. And good feedback should actually encourage reflection and dialogue. At the end of the day, we want to encourage independent thinkers, critical thinkers, especially in an academic environment. So our feedback is actually key to that. And it should encourage reflection. So if we say, have you considered using this paper, or have you considered the argument from this approach? It causes a student to think more deeply on their topic, and obviously they will use these skills moving forward. Okay, so we noticed that, and from our own experiences, there's many different supervision styles. We've just put a few of them up on the screen. And I think it's good for us to identify which one we're working with. So if we look back to our journey, we'll know that there's many different ways in which supervisors can provide feedback. And this obviously links in with a supervision style. The first one will be directive. This supervisor will tell you what to fix and how. Clear, concise, it's guiding you. The next one's going to be facilitator. Basically, this approach would be to ask questions to help the student to think critically. The next one will be supportive. So they focus more on emotional encouragement and confidence building. So if we look at those three examples, I can pose a question probably to the audience. Which do you feel would be the best approach? And if I have to quickly answer my own question, I would think it's a combination of all three. So when it comes to providing effective feedback to a student, directive, facilitative, as well as supportive, this combination actually gives a holistic support, offers holistic support to the students and allows them to grow in different areas as well. So as a supervisor, the onus is upon us as well to learn how our student communicates and adapts accordingly. Now, previous sessions have been done where they have spoken in terms of the different generations and how each of the generations likes to communicate. So I think that if we look at the students of today, and just as an opinion, if we look at the students 20 years from now or 30 years from now, I think the way in which they communicate and wish to be communicated and respond to, feedback is actually going to change. So we need to, as supervisors as well, be able to adapt to the new generations which are coming in to university as well. And nothing stops us from asking what kind of feedback that a student would prefer and how we should follow up, etc. I think that we'll notice in many cases, especially in universities overseas, from some of the conversations that I've had, this dynamic in terms of a supervisor and student is actually changing. And it's obviously being highly influenced by the students themselves and the way in which they actually respond to this feedback and wish to be communicated. So I think that is just something for us to keep in mind as well. So we'll move on to understanding feedback literacy. And this is something that obviously is not actively, it's obviously not like taught in a module, or it's not a skill set that we come across very often, but I think feedback literacy is actually essential to the growth of a student. A quick definition would be feedback literacy is the ability to understand, process, and use feedback. Not resist it or not get offended by it, but to use the feedback to improve ourselves. So as a supervisor, it is essential for us to, build this feedback literacy by, when possible, explain the rationale behind the feedback. If, for example, a student is putting together their proposal and they have chosen 5 methods and you don't agree with 2 of them, instead of just tell them, please remove these, they are incorrect. It leaves because the student feels that they would have properly researched this and this does not, and this makes sense. If we can take a minute or two and explain to the student, this is a rationale why these methods are incorrect or why they're not going to help us to answer the objectives and the research questions of the study. It allows the student to have obviously a bigger picture and they understand why they are making this major change to their particular study. I think it's also important for us to ask students to respond and reflect. So when we give feedback to a student, ask them to respond to anything that they, any comments they don't agree with or anything that feels unclear, or to reflect deeply on your comments. If you're telling them, have you considered this perspective? And ask them to respond to that as well. The last point is going to be, as a supervisor, we should encourage dialogue about feedback impact, and I think a common theme that we would have identified in this workshop would be that feedback should be a dialogue. We want to hear both sides and both perspectives of the argument. Okay, so we've spoken on briefly in the session objectives, how do we tailor feedback to the stage of research? And we've just put a few points on the slide here. We can see, so stage early, mid, and final. So let's just say early is proposal development. Mid is going to be, a year or so, a year and a half into the study. And final is just before submission. So in the early stage, feedback should actually focus on conceptual clarity, ensuring that the research question, objectives, methods, etc., are all correct. As the student goes through the experimental process and they go through their study and they approach the midpoint and they're starting to collect their data, our feedback should actually focus on data analysis. How do they construct their arguments? Structural coherence. How do they write logically? How is there a flow between their argument? And by the time it comes to, the student is close to submitting, this is the point where it is advisable for us to focus on academic tone, formatting, referencing, or polishing up of a particular chapter for submission to a journal. And the reason being is if we speak to students about data analysis early on in their study, very often they're going to be focused on actual conceptualizing the study. They may not even remember this conversation, or they may push it to the back and actually forget about it. And therefore, from our perspective, we've had the conversation from the student. They've had more important things to worry about. So us being able to identify when to provide this feedback is actually key as well. So a term that we'll hear quite often now is balancing feed forward, feedback, and encouragement.
Sorry, Doc, to interrupt.
Yeah.
Yes,
No
there is a question under the chat from
Yeah.
Dr. Abazik. Under university's timeline pressure, with students who take time to advance their works, the final submitted thesis or research not perfect. So how I can choose the discussant who she or he did not see the progress but the modest final paper. I don't know if you get that question, Doc.
Let me stop sharing, then I can probably just read it.
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing for a minute, and I'll just read the question. Okay, so I see it here. Thank you, Dr. Abir. So it says, under the university's timeline pressure with students who take time to advance their work, the final submitted thesis research is not perfect. Okay, understandable. So how can I choose the discussant who she or he did not see the progress, but what is the final paper? Dr. Abir, can you maybe, would you like to unmute your mic and maybe provide a bit more clarity in terms of what specifically you are asking on? I think Mr. Nkosi has unmuted. I'm sure Mr. Nkosi would have unmuted everyone's mics, if I'm not mistaken. Nkosi?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm wondering how can I, in the final defense, so if the final product is not such well articulated as the progress is started, so how can I choose my discussant? It's and the discussant actually his grades or her grades will be on the final product, not about this dialogue, not about this progress which happened across the year. So how can I manage between dialogue supervision and the final defense, which is harsh?
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I hope I'm able to explain this. I'll give you my answer. I think that, at all points, if we are having constant meetings, be it on let's just say every 2 weeks or every month with students, we can actually track their progress. So I think that actually would tie into each other. A student very often will not reach the final stages of their study without the supervisor having some sort of indication on, for lack of a better word, the quality of their results, if I'm understanding this correctly. So I understand that you're saying in terms of supervision and having this dialogue with the student, it is very important. But I think that everything that we're saying here does have to go hand in hand with the fact that at the end of the day, the student has enrolled for a particular degree. So it can be a master's or it can be a PhD. And while we have to be cognizant of all of these points, or many of these points that we've spoken about in terms of how we address feedback with the student, the onus is upon the student to actually make those changes in their work. So by the time the student actually reaches, let's just say, the viva, and they are defending their thesis, as a supervisor, all you can do is prepare them for that process. But in terms of the quality or the results that they have obtained, I need to be careful how I'm saying this. In terms of the results that they have obtained, that will be based upon the work that they've been doing throughout the previous couple of years. So I'm not sure, Dr. Abir, if I have answered your question correctly, but if I haven't, maybe you can pop maybe an explanation in the chat, and I'll try to address it better at the end. So my apologies if I have not answered it as required. But thank you. Okay. Okay, Kosi, are you able to see my screen again that I am sharing?
Yes, Doc, but it's not yet on presenter mode.
Okay. No, it's okay.
Yes, it is. Perfect.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So moving back to the slide, balancing feed forward, feedback, and encouragement. So like we said, a balanced approach when it comes to the students is actually essential. If we overly criticize them, can have the effect of destroying their confidence. If we only give them the positives, it can make them think that everything they're doing is correct, and therefore the quality of their work will not be at the standard that's required. So how do we balance this? In terms of feedback, your student has submitted a submission, a piece of work to you, piece of writing. So in terms of feedback, you tell them what is working, what is not working. So you can say, I like the way you've constructed your introduction. It is clear, concise. However, when you come to the discussion, I see you do not spend enough time highlighting your key findings and basically providing detailed feedback to them. Something which is equally important, not only for the student to equip them to be better in terms of their writing, but also to save you time in the next draft would be feed forward. So after we provided our feedback, a short summary in terms of how can the student improve going forward. So we can say, moving forward, I think we should focus on clarity, conciseness, structure, coherence, using more recent references, etc. And I think it's always important, remember what it's like to be a student, and therefore to foster encouragement, to affirm confidence and growth. You know, very often and I use a lot of examples from what I've experienced throughout my journey, my short journey, but what I've actually noticed is that when you come into masters, and especially when you come into PhD, your confidence can actually be shaken drastically, not only by the feedback that you get, but also sometimes how experiments go or your study is actually going. If you're not getting the correct results, and it can be for a very long period of time, it is very easy for a PhD student or a master's student to become disheartened with their progress. So I think, you know, as much as the onus is like it's upon us as a supervisor to guide them through the academic part of it, I think, you know, as human beings, and we see the struggles the students go through, to affirm their confidence and growth, to let them know that, you know what, sometimes these things happen. You know, your study may not go to plan, or your results may not be there exactly as you would have hoped for, but we push through. And I think by us continuing to encourage our students, we will actually build up resilience in them as well as in ourselves as well. Okay, so in terms of facilitating reflective dialogue, this is from the position of a supervisor. I think it's important for us to encourage students to, where possible, submit self-assessments with the drafts. So if a student is sending you an email, you know, ask them, you know, in a separate document or even in the email itself, just submit a self-assessment. What do they think of the work? Are they happy with it? Are there any areas they'd like to discuss? And by doing this here, the student is not going to be as anxious when receiving the feedback, because they are telling you, these are areas that I've identified that I'm not happy with, that I need further discussion, that I need further clarity as well. I always feel it's important to respond to feedback in writing and conversation, but that's just a personal preference. So what I generally like to do is that I will go through a particular document, I will put in my comments as normal, and then I would like to have a follow-up meeting afterwards to discuss the feedback with the student as well. And by doing this here, you know, sometimes, like we've said previously, it's difficult for tone to come across exactly in text. So if the student is anxious about receiving a piece of feedback from their supervisor, maybe it's a week late or whatever it is, every comment that they see is going to be under that lens of being negative. When actually, as a supervisor, you are just trying to be supportive. So having a quick 5 or 10-minute conversation actually does the world of good in reducing any fears and allowing the student to actually work under a better environment, as well as for yourself. I think it's also important to identify areas that they are unsure about. So once again, this is our responsibility, where we create an environment where the student feels actually comfortable to have these conversations and say, I'm not completely clear. And it does not mean you have to sit and explain every single section, every single point in that section. You can give a broad understanding and even give the student a few papers to read on, which will be able to better improve their understanding. I think what we are saying here today is that we need to find a balance. Yes, we want to support our students, but we also want them to be independent researchers. And how do we go about doing that? I think that it's going to come through practice, and we are all always learning. So in that regard, have these conversations and maybe provide them with the resources and allow them to put in the hard hours in terms of understanding certain concepts in their study as well. It never hurts to ask a question such as, what do you think went well in this chapter? And getting the students' feedback. And, it just depends on your supervision style and what the goal of these meetings are for you. Is it just to get the student to complete their degree and to graduate? Or do you have sub goals in terms of, I want to see the student display these certain scholarly attributes whenever they leave my research group as well? So we're approaching the end of the presentation, and I think I just want to end with the science behind constructive feedback. And this is primarily taken from work by Dr. Caligarin from La Trobe University, and it's Dr. Strack and Kumar who have published quite a bit in terms of feedback. So we will make these resources available to you. I think it's Elka Strack as well. So the first thing is that research shows that students grow most when feedback is actually in the form of a dialogue, a two-way exchange, not them just passively receiving. So as much as possible, a student relies on us for supervision and guidance. I always feel that we are able to learn from our students as well, maybe a different perspective, or they've read a paper that we haven't. So try and keep it, as a dialogue. The next point is timed with draft stages and not just at the end. So we will notice that if a student is actually sending in a draft all the time, and we consistently give feedback, they are able to improve the next draft or the next chapter, and it just becomes a bit more manageable for the student as well. I think setting these goals and deadlines for the student actually help them, even though they may not be too happy about it. And I think this actually would be tied to clear goals or rubrics that you would have discussed in your supervisor or feedback agreement as well. So at the end of it, if we summarize, constructive feedback should actually build competence, reduce fear of failure, and encourage reflection. Those are the 3 points that I think is actually key when it comes to what is the goal of feedback. Is not just to correct and show them where they're going wrong, but it's also to help them grow as academics and people at the end of the day as well. So these are some resources, the same resources that we've discussed in previous workshops. So the first one would be Finding Confidence in Writing Doctoral Writing Groups. This is by Dr. Callie Garin and Claire Atchison. And the one that I would actually like to bring to your attention, if you're looking for some additional reading around this topic in terms of feedback, especially in doctoral supervision, I would read the work by Vijay Kumar and Elka Strack. I've actually heard Dr. Strack present at a workshop recently, and some of the work, the ideas that she had was actually very impressive and very informative. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and for joining us for today's session. I'm going to stop sharing and hand over back to Nkosi, who would be able to take over. Thank you, Nkosi.
Thank you so much, Dr. David, for such a very informative session. To colleagues, enable all your mics. So if you do have any questions for Dr. David or other colleagues, just unmute your mic. No need to raise your hand now. You can just unmute your mic and ask a question. Or if you want to add something, probably that you think it was missed out, so you can just unmute your mic and make your contribution. Alternatively, you can still type under the chat or under Q&A, and I will go through some few chats or under Q&A. So in the meantime, I have also shared the feedback evaluation earlier. So I kindly request you colleagues to take your 2 minutes and fill that feedback in. It helps us in terms of improving our service delivery, as well as to give feedback to our facilitators for taking their time in facilitating these kinds of workshops that we are having. So now I'll be waiting for questions or any contributions. Thank you. Okay, it seems like there are no new questions. I see Dr. Abia answered you, Dr. David. Thank you. That is a good insight. I have to consider, be honest with the student across the process. Thanks. So that was regarding the question she asked earlier.
Can I just add something, Nkosi, to that? I think it's important for us, as a let's just say, as an emerging academic, and when we are getting into the space of supervising students, it's very easy for us to actually make the mistake of, or rather mix up wanting to help the student, and to what extent. And I think something that's quite important, and something that was actually pointed out to me quite recently, is that our willingness to help the student, our passion to help the student and to help them achieve, let's just say, a particular degree or complete their thesis, should never come at the expense of robbing the student of that experience in terms of going through the learning process. I think when it comes to supervision, it is something that it's my personal belief that we'll always be learning throughout our careers. But I think being able to balance in terms of, I want to help the student, but I also want them to become independent in their researches. And that often means going through struggle and challenges. As many people in the audience today would understand, when it comes to high degrees, there are a lot of struggles, there are a lot of challenges that you will face. But once you get through them, and when you look back, you will actually understand is that struggle and that challenges actually help to shape you to be the researcher that you are today. So the only thing, and of course, I would actually close this. I won't say anything after this, but I'd like to say that when it comes to supervision, I feel that it's always important for us to look from the perspective of a student. How does it feel to be in that position? But we also need to look at it from the lens of being a supervisor, and how can we best equip the students to reach their full potential? Is that going to be achieved by me answering all the questions or providing, doing the work for them? Or do I, have to take a step back and know when to take a step back, allow the student to go through the struggle, and through that process is where they will learn and develop. But with that, Nkosi, that's all I will say. So thank you very much. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. David. Colleagues, I don't know if I'll be closing anyone out with a burning question or any contribution before I can officially end this session. So I'll give it 30 seconds. Okay, thank you, colleagues. Dr. Smith, Dr. Abia, thank you. Okay. So thank you so much, colleagues, for joining. Please note that this workshop was recorded, and the recording of this workshop, as well as the presentation of this workshop, will be shared to your respective Moodle communities, which includes the supervisor and PDRF community. However, we encourage colleagues to register their profile or complete their profile via RCTMS, where they can book their workshop of choice and be able to generate their own certificate of attendance. So immediately after the workshop has ended, you can download your certificate of attendance. But to those colleagues that are using links and the model communities, we still send out certificates to all the colleagues who have attended. Sometimes colleagues, the process takes time, so we become late in doing that sometimes due to other commitments that are here at work, but we do ensure that everyone who have attended the workshop gets a certificate of attendance. So we have sent out a May certificate, as I've mentioned in the beginning of the workshop. So the only certificate that are remaining now are the ones for June. So the June one will be out by end of this week, meaning by Friday. If you attended any workshop in June, between June, and you didn't get any certificate of attendance by end of Friday, so you can send us an email with the title of the workshop that you have attended. But in the meantime, if you are waiting for a June certificate for any workshop you have attended, I can assure you that by end of Friday, you will get your certificate. Those who have queries regarding their May certificate, if you didn't at all get any certificate and yet you attended any of the workshop, kindly send us an email with the title of the workshop that you have attended in May, and also your details, which includes your staff number, your title, and your student number if you are using a student number, and your full names, and then we will issue a certificate of attendance. To the colleagues who have sent their emails to get a corrected certificate, I will attend to those queries this week, so you will get your corrected certificates as well during this week. With that being said, thank you so much, colleagues, once again. I hope to meet you in the next workshop, so the communication will be shared with all our upcoming workshops for July. And thank you so much once again to our facilitator, Dr. Lorenzo David. If I'm not closing anyone out, I'll be now closing or ending this workshop. So thank you so much, and thank you to Dr. David. Always a pleasure to have you as our facilitator, and to all the colleagues, thank you. You can have a great day further. I'm now officially closing the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.